Hey there. Ever seen the news say your government just blew billions on something ridiculous while the whole country is drowning in debt? People get furious, they panic, they start yelling online. But here's the crazy part. Almost every single country on earth is in debt. India, Germany, Switzerland, Qatar, you name it. Even the big, rich, powerful nations aren't safe. The United States owes a jaw-dropping $39 trillion and still counting. And one country owes more than twice its entire economy, and yet it's somehow completely fine. We'll get to how that's even possible later. But first, this. Right now, the US is adding around $5 billion of new debt every single day. That's almost $95,000 every second. By the time this sentence ends, America is already deeper in debt. Sounds insane, right? So, have you ever wondered, why is every country in debt? Why don't they just print unlimited money? Is debt actually that bad? And if countries owe money, then who on earth are they borrowing from? And can a country ever be truly debt-free? In this video, we'll break down everything you need to know about national debt. Let's get started. Section 1. What is national debt? When we talk about a country's debt, we call it national debt. National debt, also called public debt, government debt, or sovereign debt, is the total amount of money a federal or central government owes. Just like regular people take out loans when they're short on cash, governments borrow when they spend more than they earn. But instead of walking into one bank, countries get their money from many sources like other nations, giant financial institutions, and even their own citizens. Now, one important thing. National debt only counts the central government's debt. So, U.S. national debt only includes the U.S. federal government's debt. It does not include state debts like California or Texas borrowing on their own, and it also doesn't include personal debt like your credit cards, your student loans, or your mortgage. That's all separate. Here's a fun way to picture America's $39 trillion. About $31 trillion is money the government borrowed from the public, meaning investors, banks, and foreigners. And around $8 trillion is money the government literally owes to itself. Yeah, itself. It sounds like a glitch, and we'll get to that weird part later. So now you know what national debt is. Your next question is probably, why do countries borrow in the first place? Let's find out in the next section. Section 2. Why do countries borrow money? Okay, but why borrow at all? Why not just fire up the printer and make more money? Well, when governments print money mindlessly, they suddenly feel like they have unlimited cash, so they spend recklessly and flood the economy with money. This causes hyperinflation, prices skyrocket, and the whole economy crashes. Investors and foreign countries lose trust, and the money becomes as worthless as toilet paper. This already happened in Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Borrowing, on the other hand, keeps governments disciplined because debt comes with interest, and interest forces them to manage money responsibly. If you want the full story, check out my video, Why Don't We Just Print More Money? Link in the description. So here are the real reasons governments borrow. The first is to cover budget deficits. A government's main income comes from taxes, but sometimes taxes just aren't enough. For example, the US is running a deficit of nearly $2 trillion in 2026 alone. So what are the options? Cut spending? That means worse schools, worse hospitals, angry people protesting the next day. Raise taxes? That makes everyone's life harder and, yeah, more protests. So the easiest option, the one that upsets the fewest people today, is simply to borrow and deal with it later. And politicians love later, because later is usually someone else's problem. The second reason is to invest in growth. Imagine your country needs roads, schools, and hospitals, but the government has no money and refuses to borrow. They'd have to wait years saving up while people suffer with bad roads and no schools. But if they borrow, they build all of it now. These investments help the economy grow, which brings in more tax money later, making the debt easier to pay off. Good debt, basically. The third reason is to handle crises. When wars, disasters, or pandemics hit, governments have to act fast. In 2020 alone, the US borrowed $3.8 trillion, about 18% of its economy, for COVID relief and stimulus checks. Without it, millions more would have lost their jobs. The fourth reason is to pay off old debt. And this one's my favorite because you actually do this too. Ever paid off one credit card using another credit card? Yeah, governments have mastered that exact trick, just with a lot more zeros. A country borrows in 2015, can't pay it back in 2025, so it just borrows again to repay the first loan. And the cycle continues. As long as it's managed responsibly, it's fine. But when it spirals out of control, that's when countries collapse. and we'll see some genuinely scary examples soon. So now we know why countries borrow. The next big question is, who is actually lending them all this money? Let's find out. Section 3. Who lends money to countries? All right, quick pause. Governments take on billions, sometimes trillions in debt. So stop and think for a second. Which bank on earth even has trillions of dollars just lying around to lend? The answer is none of them do. Because the money doesn't come from one place. It comes from three: domestic lenders, foreign lenders, and the central bank. Let's break it down. First, domestic lenders. Believe it or not, you can lend money to your own country. This is done through bonds. When you buy a government bond, you're lending money to the government, and it pays you back later plus interest. Regular citizens can buy them, big banks like Bank of America can buy them, and even pension funds and companies buy them as safe investments. And here's that weird part I promised you. Government agencies buy bonds too. In the US, the Social Security Fund alone holds around $2.7 trillion in government bonds. So the government borrows from itself and pays itself interest. It's not a glitch, it's just accounting. Wild, right? Second, foreign lenders. Other countries buy your bonds too, usually as a safe investment to earn interest. And here's a fact almost everyone gets wrong. Everyone assumes China owns most of America's debt. Nope. As of 2026, the biggest foreign holder of US debt is Japan with over $1.1 trillion. Second place, the United Kingdom with around $860 billion. And China has actually dropped to third at about $690 billion, and it's been quietly selling off US debt for years, down from a peak of $1.3 trillion back in 2013. So that whole China owns America story you keep hearing, kind of outdated. But here's the catch. Foreign governments only lend to countries they trust. If your economy is weak, most won't buy your bonds, because they're scared you won't pay them back. Instead, weaker countries turn to organizations like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank for direct loans to build roads, schools, and power plants. These come with lower interest but strict conditions. And if a country is totally broke, in chaos, and nobody will lend to it, there's one last resort: the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF gives emergency loans to stop total collapse, but with brutal conditions like raising taxes, cutting spending, and privatizing companies, which often trigger even more protests. Third, the central bank. Governments can, in theory, borrow from their own central bank. This is called debt monetization, where the central bank prints new money to buy government bonds. But most countries avoid doing this directly because it can cause hyperinflation. Instead, they do it indirectly, buying bonds from commercial banks, mostly to control interest rates, not to fund the government. Now that we know who lends the money, let's ask the big one. Is national debt actually a bad thing? Let's find out. Section 4. Is national debt a bad thing? Well, not really. Debt can be good or bad, and it all depends on how it's used. Used wisely, debt builds infrastructure, powers the economy, and saves the country during a crisis, like COVID. Used recklessly, it becomes a monster. Because if a country keeps borrowing just to repay old debt and then borrows again to pay that, it falls into what's called a debt trap. Same as maxing out one credit card to pay another, then a third to pay those two. You already know how that story ends. And here's where it gets scary. Look at the United States. In 2025, the US paid nearly $1 trillion just in interest on its debt. Not paying off the debt itself, just the interest. To put that in perspective, that's about $3 billion every single day. And for the first time in American history, the US now spends more on interest than on its entire military, and more than on Medicare. Interest is now the third biggest expense in the whole budget. That's money that could have gone to schools, hospitals, or roads, just vanishing into interest payments. But America is a rich, stable country, so it can handle it, for now. The real tragedy is in poorer nations. Right now, 3.4 billion people, almost half the planet, live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on health or education. And it gets more unfair. African countries often pay 4 times more to borrow than the US and 8 times more than rich European nations, just because lenders see them as risky. So the poor pay more and the rich pay less. That's the brutal math of global debt. And when debt truly spirals, countries default, meaning they give up on paying. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022, its economy collapsed, and mass protests overthrew the president. Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia have all defaulted recently too. Though here's a +1 for never giving up, Sri Lanka has actually been recovering since then, slowly stabilizing its economy. So, how much debt is too much? Economists use the debt to GDP ratio, comparing a country's debt to the size of its economy. Around 60% is considered safe, but it's not a strict rule. Today, 23 countries owe more than their entire economy produces in a single year. Which brings us to the craziest example of all, the one I teased at the very start. Japan. Japan's debt is over 200% of its economy, one of the highest on Earth. By all logic, it should have collapsed already. But it hasn't. Why? Because nearly half of Japan's debt is owned by its own central bank, and most of the rest by its own citizens. So the interest the government pays basically flows right back into its own pocket. It's the left hand paying the right hand. On top of that, Japan actually invested a lot of that borrowed money into stocks and assets around the world. So its real net debt is far lower than the scary headline number suggests. That's why a country that borrows in its own currency from its own people can survive debt levels that would instantly destroy anyone else. So debt isn't just about the number, it's about who you owe and how you manage it. Now, your next question might be, can a country just be 100% debt-free? Let's find out. Section 5. Can a country be debt-free? Technically, yes. But in reality, almost none are, and honestly, most don't even want to be. So, is there a country with zero debt? Basically none. Every country carries some level of debt. The closest example is Macau, which has essentially zero debt, thanks to its massive casino income, even bigger than Las Vegas. But Macau isn't a country. It's a special region of China, so it doesn't count. Among real nations, the lowest are tiny wealthy ones like Liechtenstein at around 0.5% and oil-rich Brunei at just 2.3%. But here's a twist. Some countries have low debt not because they're strong, but because they're weak. Tiny island nations like Tuvalu have almost no debt simply because no one will lend to them, and their economies are too small to borrow much in the first place. That's not strength. That's fragility wearing a friendly mask. One bad storm, or one lost aid deal, and they're suddenly in crisis. And even if a country could wipe out all its debt, most wouldn't want to. Being fully debt-free would mean massive spending cuts or huge tax hikes, both of which slow the economy and spark protests. Plus, no debt means no government bonds. And that's actually a problem because pension funds all around the world rely on those safe bonds to grow people's retirement money. Take away the bonds, and pensions are forced into riskier investments, making everyone's retirement less secure. So a world with zero government debt might sound like a dream, but it could quietly make your retirement a nightmare. So, in conclusion, debt is a double-edged sword. Used wisely, it can help a country grow, thrive, and survive disasters. Used recklessly, it can lead to total economic ruin. So the next time you hear someone ask, why is our country in debt, you already know the real answer. It's not about having debt, it's about knowing how to manage it. Because a country can owe trillions and be perfectly fine, or owe far less and completely collapse. The number on the screen is never the whole story. And maybe you're still wondering, why do some countries handle massive debt just fine, while others fall apart over much less? Well, that's a whole rabbit hole for another video. If you want me to explain more topics like this, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.